Get on your knees, you worthless slob, before I remind you who owns every inch of this prison yard.
I'm not here to prove anything. I just want to do my time without giving anyone trouble.
That isn't your choice anymore, because around here I decide who gets left alone and who suffers.
Then save yourself the trouble and keep walking. Neither of us needs to make today any worse.
Everybody's watching now, and if you don't hit the ground first, I'll make sure you never forget me.
Travis slammed both hands into Malcolm's chest, but Malcolm barely moved. The entire prison yard fell silent as inmates gathered around, expecting another easy victim to be humiliated. Malcolm stayed calm, refusing to react or throw the first punch. Travis had no idea the quiet inmate standing in front of him had spent decades mastering the kind of fight he believed he could never lose. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The gate clanked shut behind Malcolm Rains with the sound of metal biting metal. 2 guards flanked him as he stepped into the Halden Ridge yard, their boots scraping against cracked concrete that had seen too much blood and too many broken men. The late afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows across the exercise area where clusters of inmates had been lifting weights, playing cards, and talking in hushed voices. Now, the yard fell silent. Malcolm wore bright orange. Every other man in sight wore faded gray prison uniforms that had been washed 1,000 times until the fabric looked like old dishwater. The orange jumpsuit marked him as fresh meat, a new arrival who hadn't earned his place in the prison hierarchy. It made him stand out like a target painted on a wall. He was a heavy-set black man, 50 years old, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that showed no fear. His shoulders stayed loose and natural as he walked. His hands remained visible at his sides. His dark eyes moved steadily across the yard, taking in the watchtowers, the concrete walls topped with razor wire, and the men who had stopped what they were doing to stare at him. Malcolm looked soft. That was the first impression. A man carrying extra weight around his middle, moving without hurry or aggression. The kind of inmate who might get eaten alive in a place like this. Travis Barlow noticed him immediately. Barlow was 42 years old and built like a man who had spent years turning his body into a weapon. His arms were thick with muscle and covered in tattoos that told stories of violence and hate. His face was scarred from old fights, and his eyes held the cold look of someone who enjoyed causing pain. He had been running this yard for 3 years, and every inmate knew his name. Well, well, well. Barlow's voice carried across the concrete as he started walking toward Malcolm. Look what they brought us today. Other inmates began moving closer, forming a loose circle around the new arrival. Some looked curious, others looked hungry for entertainment. A few stepped back, knowing what was coming and wanting no part of it. Luis Ortega, a 24-year-old inmate with nervous eyes and quick hands, had been sitting at a picnic table when the gate opened. He watched Malcolm enter and felt his stomach drop. The older man looked decent, maybe even kind, and that made him exactly the type Barlow loved to destroy. "You hearing me, fat boy?" Barlow called out, his voice getting louder as he approached. "I'm talking to you." Malcolm stopped walking. He turned to face Barlow with the same calm expression he had worn since entering the yard. His breathing stayed even. His posture remained relaxed but balanced. "Cat got your tongue?" Barlow stepped closer, now just a few feet away. "Or maybe you're too scared to open that mouth of yours." The circle of inmates tightened. More men drifted over from other parts of the yard, drawn by the smell of fresh blood in the water. They knew this routine. Barlow would humiliate the new fish, maybe hurt him bad enough to send a message, and everyone would remember who owned this place. Luis slid closer to the edge of the crowd. "Don't answer him," he whispered, just loud enough for Malcolm to hear. "He hurts men for sport. Just keep quiet and maybe he'll get bored." But Malcolm didn't look like a man who got bullied into silence. Captain Elias Pike stood near the chain-link fence that separated the yard from the administrative building. He was 48 years old, with thinning hair and cold blue eyes that missed nothing. Pike had been watching the scene unfold with the detached interest of someone observing lab rats in a maze. He made no move to intervene. His hands stayed folded behind his back, as if this was all perfectly normal. "You think you're better than us?" Barlow's voice rose to a shout. "Walking in here like you own the place? Like you're some kind of tough guy?" Malcolm said nothing. His eyes stayed on Barlow's face, not challenging but not backing down either. He stood like a man who had learned patience the hard way. "I asked you a question." Barlow stepped forward until they were almost chest to chest. "You answer me when I'm talking to you, old man." The yard held its breath. Even the guards in the watchtowers had turned to watch. Barlow shoved Malcolm's chest hard, putting his full weight behind it. The push was strong enough to rock Malcolm back on his heels, but the older man only planted his feet wider and absorbed the impact. He didn't stumble. He didn't raise his hands. He just stood there, solid as a tree. "That's right," Barlow smiled, showing yellow teeth. "You belong to me now." He raised his fist as the inmates pressed closer, tightening the circle around them both. Barlow's fist came fast and hard, aimed straight at Malcolm's nose. The punch carried all the rage and muscle of a man who had never learned to lose. The circle of inmates leaned forward, expecting to see blood spray across the concrete. Malcolm shifted his weight to his right foot and slipped half a step to the side. The movement was so small, so smooth, that some of the watching men almost missed it. Barlow's fist whistled through empty air, where Malcolm's face had been a heartbeat before. As Barlow's arm shot past him, Malcolm reached out with his left hand and guided the punch further along its path, using Barlow's own momentum against him. At the same time, Malcolm's right hand formed a precise blade and snapped forward into Barlow's ribs with surgical accuracy. The strike landed just below the bigger man's armpit, finding the exact spot where bone met muscle. The sound was sharp and clean, like a stick breaking. Barlow's eyes went wide. He stumbled forward 3 steps, his breathing suddenly ragged. The punch that was supposed to break Malcolm's nose had become nothing but wasted motion and embarrassment. "What was that?" Barlow gasped, pressing his hand to his side. Pain shot through his ribs like lightning. He had never felt anything like it. The yard was dead quiet. Even the pigeons had stopped moving along the fence line. Luis stood frozen at the edge of the circle, his mouth hanging open. The fat man had barely moved, but Barlow was hurt. Actually hurt. The most feared inmate in Halden Ridge was holding his ribs and trying to catch his breath like he had been hit by a truck. "You'll pay for that." Barlow's face twisted with fury and humiliation. He could feel every eye in the yard watching him. His reputation, built on years of violence and fear, was cracking right in front of everyone. He charged forward like a bull, reaching with both hands to grab Malcolm's throat. This time, he would squeeze until the old man's face turned blue. This time, there would be no tricks. Malcolm watched Barlow come at him with the same calm expression he had worn since entering the yard. As Barlow's hands reached for his neck, Malcolm stepped back with his left foot and pivoted on his right, turning his body at a 45-degree angle. The movement was fluid and practiced, like he had done it 10,000 times before. Barlow's momentum carried him forward into empty space. Malcolm reached across his own body, caught Barlow's wrist with both hands, and used the bigger man's charging weight to guide him down and forward. There was no anger in the technique, no wasted effort, just physics and perfect timing. Barlow hit the gravel hard, landing on his shoulder and rolling onto his back. His legs kicked up dust as he tried to get his bearings. The man who had controlled the yard through fear and violence was flat on his back, staring up at the sky while a heavy-set inmate in orange stood over him without even breathing hard. The silence stretched on. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The watchtower guards stared down at the scene like they were witnessing something impossible. Barlow rolled onto his side, gasping. His face burned with embarrassment more than pain. Every inmate in the yard had just watched him get dropped by a man who looked like somebody's grandfather. The worst part was how easy Malcolm had made it look, like Barlow was nothing more than an angry child throwing a tantrum. Luis felt his knees go weak. The quiet man in orange had moved like water, like someone who had spent decades learning how to make violence look effortless. This was not luck. This was not desperation. This was skill so deep it looked like magic to men who only knew how to fight with rage and muscle. Captain Pike had been watching from the fence line, his arms folded across his chest. For 3 minutes, he had made no move to intervene. He had let Barlow start the confrontation, let it build, let it explode into something the whole yard could see. Only now, with Barlow on the ground and his authority shattered, did Pike finally walk forward. His boots crunched across the gravel as he approached the circle of inmates. Men stepped aside to let him through, their faces still stunned by what they had witnessed. "Break it up," Pike called out, his voice carrying the lazy authority of a man who enjoyed watching chaos before restoring order. "Show's over." He looked down at Barlow, who was still trying to get back on his feet. Then his cold blue eyes shifted to Malcolm, who stood exactly where he had been when the fight ended. Patient, calm, waiting. "Cuff him," Pike told the guards who had followed him into the crowd. Luis felt his heart sink. Him? But Barlow started it. Everyone saw starting violence on his first day, Pike continued, ignoring Luis completely. His eyes never left Malcolm's face. "Can't have that kind of behavior in my prison." 2 guards stepped forward with handcuffs. Malcolm looked at Pike for a long moment, understanding exactly what was happening. The system was rigged. Justice was not part of the game. He had defended himself against a bully, and now he would be punished for it, while Barlow walked free. Malcolm held out his hands, wrists together, and let them cuff him without resistance. The concrete walls of the intake corridor felt like they were closing in as the guards marched Malcolm away from the yard. His orange jumpsuit stood out against the gray paint like a target, and the sound of his shackled feet echoed off the narrow walls. Behind him, through the reinforced glass windows, he could see Barlow's crew helping their leader to his feet. Captain Pike walked alongside the guards, his boots hitting the floor with sharp, deliberate strikes. His jaw was tight, and his pale eyes burned with something that went beyond anger. This was personal now. In 3 minutes, Malcolm had made Pike's most useful enforcer look weak in front of 200 inmates. "Stop here," Pike ordered, when they reached a section of corridor lined with holding cells. The guards shoved Malcolm against the concrete wall, pressing his face into the cold surface. Pike stepped close, so close that Malcolm could smell the coffee on his breath and the starch in his uniform. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Pike's voice was low and dangerous. Malcolm kept his eyes forward, staring at the gray paint inches from his nose. "I taught karate for 30 years before I came here." "Karate?" Pike said the word like it tasted bitter. "Some kind of martial arts master, is that what you think you are?" "I taught kids in my community," Malcolm replied quietly. "Help them stay out of trouble." Pike pressed closer, his forearm against Malcolm's shoulder blade. "Well, you're in trouble now, old man. You just made yourself the biggest threat in my prison. Can't have someone like you walking around, giving the other inmates ideas about fighting back." Malcolm felt the pressure against his back increase, but he did not resist. He had learned long ago that there were battles worth fighting, and battles that only made things worse. Right now, Pike held all the cards. "Solitary confinement," Pike announced to the guards. "Indefinite, for everyone's safety." "Sir," one of the younger guards began. He was defending himself. Barlow attacked first. Pike's head snapped toward the guard like a whip. "Did I ask for your opinion, Martinez? The report will show that inmate Raines engaged in violent conduct on his first day. That makes him a danger to staff and other prisoners." The guard's mouth closed. He looked at Malcolm with something that might have been sympathy, but he did not speak again. "Move him," Pike ordered. As they led Malcolm deeper into the corridor, Captain Pike turned and walked toward the medical wing. Through the reinforced glass door, he could see Nurse Denise Carter examining Barlow's ribs while the big man laughed with his crew. "Just some bruising," Denise was saying, her voice professional but cold. "Nothing serious." Barlow grinned, showing his yellowed teeth. "That old man got lucky. Caught me off guard, that's all." His crew nodded and made agreeing sounds, but Denise could see the truth in their eyes. They had watched their leader get dropped twice by a man who barely looked like he was trying. Luck had nothing to do with it. "Ice for the bruising," Denise continued, handing Barlow a cold pack. "You'll be fine in a day or two." Through the doorway, she caught sight of Malcolm being led past in handcuffs. His wrists were already turning purple where the metal had cut into his skin during the fight. She had seen this pattern before. The victim gets punished while the aggressor walks free. It was one of the reasons she had stopped believing in justice years ago. Denise made a note in her report about Barlow's minor injuries. Then, quietly, she made another note about the bruising she had observed on the hands of inmate Rains, who had been cuffed and removed from the scene despite defending himself against an unprovoked attack. Back in the yard, Barlow's crew gathered around him like wolves protecting their wounded alpha. His face still burned with humiliation, and his ribs ached every time he took a deep breath. But worse than the physical pain was the knowledge that every man in the prison had seen him flat on his back. "He embarrassed me," Barlow snarled, his voice carrying across the concrete benches where inmates pretended not to listen. "Made me look like a fool in front of the whole yard." "We'll get him back," one of his men promised. "Pike's got him in solitary now. When he comes out, we break him," Barlow interrupted. "Completely. So every man in this place knows what happens when you make Travis Barlow look weak." The crew nodded, their faces hard with promised violence. "And if any other inmate starts thinking they can resist like that old man did," Barlow continued, his voice rising so more prisoners could hear, "we break them too. This yard belongs to me, not some fat karate teacher who thinks he's tough." Deep in the solitary wing, Malcolm heard Barlow's voice echoing off the concrete walls. The words carried through the ventilation system like poison, promising that the yard would finish what had started in the circle. Malcolm sat on the narrow metal bunk in his cell and closed his eyes. The victory had lasted 3 minutes. Now, the real fight was about to begin. The metal door of the solitary wing groaned open, echoing through the narrow corridor like a dying animal. Malcolm sat cross-legged on the concrete floor of his cell, his back straight despite the pain shooting through his shoulders. The handcuffs had left deep purple marks around his wrists, and every breath reminded him of the pressure Captain Pike had put on his spine against the wall. He breathed slowly, counting each inhale and exhale the way he had taught his students years ago. In through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 6. The rhythm helped push away the throbbing in his hands and the anger that wanted to burn in his chest. The sound of wheels on concrete interrupted his meditation. Someone was pushing a food cart down the corridor, stopping at each cell to slide meal trays through the narrow slots. The footsteps were careful and measured, not the heavy boots of a guard. "Dinner," a quiet voice said outside Malcolm's cell. Malcolm opened his eyes and looked up at the man standing beyond the bars. He was tall and thin, maybe in his late 60s, with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore the same gray uniform as the other inmates, but his had an orange stripe on the sleeve that marked him as an orderly. The man slid a plastic tray through the slot. Rice, some kind of meat, green beans that looked like they had been cooked too long. The food was cold, but it smelled better than nothing. "Thank you," Malcolm said, standing slowly to take the tray. The orderly studied Malcolm's face through the bars. His expression changed from polite indifference to something like recognition. "Wait," the man said softly. "I know you." Malcolm paused, the tray balanced in his hands. He looked more closely at the orderly's face, searching his memory. "Reverend Samuel Gray," the man said. "I run the chapel services here, but I knew you before this place." He glanced down the corridor to make sure no guards were listening. "You're Malcolm Rains. You ran that karate school in Charleston." The name hit Malcolm like a punch to the stomach. It had been almost 15 years since anyone had called him by his full name without spitting it like a curse. "Rains Community Karate," Gray continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "You taught kids for free in that old warehouse on King Street. I remember reading about your program in the paper. Good kids, staying out of trouble." Malcolm set the tray down and moved closer to the bars. "How do you know about that?" I was a pastor in North Charleston back then, Gray said. Some of those boys you trained came to my church. They talked about you like you were their father. His face grew sad. Then I saw those headlines. They said you nearly killed some young man in a street fight. The words brought back memories Malcolm had spent years trying to bury. The dark alley behind his dojo, the sound of screaming, the flash of knives in the streetlight, the police arriving just in time to see him standing over a bleeding teenager. I was framed, Malcolm said quietly. Gray nodded slowly. I figured as much. The Malcolm Rains those kids talked about wouldn't hurt anyone unless he had no choice. 3 gang members jumped a kid outside my school, Malcolm continued, his voice growing stronger. I went out to help. By the time it was over, one of them was unconscious and the other 2 were gone. The police said I was the aggressor, and the kid you were trying to help disappeared, never testified. His family moved away the next week. Malcolm gripped the bars with both hands. Someone made sure he stayed quiet. Gray looked down the corridor again, then back at Malcolm. That's interesting, because Travis Barlow's crew has been talking about you all afternoon. Not the way inmates usually talk about new fish. They knew your name before you ever stepped foot in that yard. Malcolm felt ice water run down his spine. What do you mean? I mean they were expecting you, Gray said. Barlow told his boys that a karate teacher from Charleston was coming in today. He knew exactly who you were. The implications hit Malcolm like a sledgehammer. His arrest had not been random. His conviction had not been an accident. Someone had wanted him in this prison, in this yard, facing Travis Barlow. There's something else, Gray said, pulling a crumpled napkin from his pocket. Captain Pike and Barlow have history. Pike protects Barlow, and Barlow does Pike's dirty work. They run this place together. He slipped the napkin through the bars. Malcolm unfolded it and saw words written in careful handwriting. Pike and Barlow work together. Be careful, Malcolm, Gray whispered. This isn't just about prison politics. Someone wanted you here. The Reverend pushed his cart to the next cell, leaving Malcolm alone with questions that multiplied like cancer in his mind. Who had framed him? Why did Barlow know his name? What connection existed between his past and this place? The lights in the corridor suddenly went dark. It was barely 8 o'clock, too early for lights out, but the solitary wing operated by different rules. In the blackness, Malcolm heard footsteps approaching his cell. Slow, deliberate steps, accompanied by a metallic scraping sound. Someone was dragging a baton along the bars outside his cell. The metallic scraping grew louder as the footsteps stopped directly outside Malcolm's cell. The darkness seemed to press against him like a living thing, thick and suffocating in the narrow space. "Stand up, inmate!" The voice cut through the blackness like a blade. Cold, official, dangerous. Malcolm recognized Captain Pike's voice immediately. He remained seated against the concrete wall, his breathing steady and controlled. The karate training that had saved his life in the yard now helped him stay calm in the face of whatever was coming. I said, "Stand up." Pike's voice carried the kind of authority that had broken weaker men. "When I'm talking to you, you show respect." The overhead light flickered on, harsh and sudden. Malcolm squinted as his eyes adjusted to see Pike standing outside the bars with 2 guards flanking him. The captain wore his uniform like armor, every crease perfect, every button polished. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. Malcolm rose slowly to his feet, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He would not give Pike the satisfaction of seeing fear or haste. "Better," Pike said, pulling out a clipboard. "Now we're going to have a conversation about how things work in my prison." The 2 guards stood silent as statues, their hands resting on their batons. One was young with nervous eyes. The other was older, with the dead stare of a man who had seen too much violence to care about seeing more. "You made quite a scene in the yard today," Pike continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. "Embarrassed one of my most reliable inmates, created a disturbance, made other prisoners think they could follow your example." Malcolm said nothing. He kept his eyes on Pike's face, reading the man's intentions like he had once read his students' movements during sparring sessions. "See, You don't understand how Halden Ridge operates, Pike explained, pacing slowly in front of the cell. Men like Travis Barlow serve a purpose. They maintain order through fear. They keep the weak inmates in line. They make my job easier. The captain stopped pacing and faced Malcolm directly. Men like you are a problem. You give other inmates dangerous ideas about dignity and self-respect. You make them think they can fight back. I was defending myself, Malcolm said quietly. Pike's smile was colder than the concrete walls. No, you were disrupting the natural order of things, and that requires correction. The captain nodded to the guards. The older one stepped forward and unlocked the cell door with a harsh metallic clang. Both men entered the small space, forcing Malcolm to step back against the wall. Here's how this is going to work, Pike said from the doorway. Tomorrow morning, you're going to find Travis Barlow in the yard. You're going to apologize to him in front of every inmate who saw you embarrass him. You're going to tell him you were wrong to disrespect him. Malcolm met Pike's stare without blinking. No, I wasn't asking, Pike replied. His voice remained calm, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. I was giving you an order that will save your life. I won't apologize for protecting myself, Malcolm said. Each word came out clear and steady. And I won't bow down to a bully just because you tell me to. Pike studied Malcolm for a long moment, like a scientist examining an interesting specimen. I see. You think this is about pride. You think this is about standing up for yourself. He shook his head slowly. This is about survival, inmate, and you just chose the hard way. Pike nodded again. The guards moved through Malcolm's cell like a hurricane, tearing apart everything he owned. They dumped his bedding on the floor, scattered his few personal items, and searched every corner with unnecessary violence. When they found the small stack of letters hidden under his thin mattress, Pike's eyes lit up with cruel satisfaction. What have we here? The guards handed the letters to Pike, who examined them with the careful attention of a man reading evidence. Each envelope was addressed in the same careful handwriting. Malcolm Raines, from Elaine Raines. Your daughter? Pike asked, already knowing the answer. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Pike began opening the letters one by one, reading them with theatrical slowness. Dear Daddy, I hope you're staying strong. I miss you so much. I'm still working to prove your innocence. He looked up at Malcolm with mock sympathy. How touching! The captain continued reading, tossing each letter to the floor when he finished. Malcolm watched his daughter's words scattered across the dirty concrete, feeling something crack inside his chest. Pike opened the last envelope and pulled out 2 sheets of paper. As he read, his expression changed from boredom to sharp interest. Well, listen to this, gentlemen. He cleared his throat and began reading aloud. Daddy, I found something important. There was a witness to your fight that night, a homeless man named Jerry Polk. He's been living in Atlanta, but I tracked him down. He remembers everything. He says you were protecting that kid, not attacking him. He's willing to testify. The silence in the cell became deadly. Pike folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his uniform pocket. Malcolm felt rage building in his chest like lava preparing to erupt. For the first time since entering Halden Ridge, his calm mask began to crack. His hands slowly clenched into fists. Interesting reading material, Pike said, backing toward the cell door. Don't worry, inmate. I'll make sure this letter gets filed in the proper place. The guards followed Pike out of the cell, slamming the door behind them. The lock clicked into place with a sound like a death sentence. Pike paused at the bars one final time. You have 24 hours to reconsider my offer. Apologize to Barlow publicly, or things get much worse for you, and for your daughter's little investigation. The captain and his guards walked away, their footsteps echoing down the corridor until silence returned. Malcolm stood alone in the destroyed cell, surrounded by his daughter's torn letters. For the first time since arriving at Halden Ridge, his eyes burned with pure, undiluted fury. The heavy steel door of solitary confinement swung open with a grinding screech that echoed through the corridor like a wounded animal. Malcolm stepped out into the harsh fluorescent light, squinting as his eyes adjusted after hours in complete darkness. The orange jumpsuit clung to his body, still marking him as different from every other inmate in the block. 2 guards flanked him as they walked down the long hallway. Their boots clicked against polished concrete in perfect rhythm. Other inmates pressed against their cell bars to watch the procession, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and fear. Word had already spread through the prison grapevine about what happened in the yard. "Remember what Captain Pike told you," the older guard muttered without looking at Malcolm. "You got 24 hours to make this right." Malcolm said nothing. His face remained calm, but his daughter's words burned in his memory like acid. The letter Pike had stolen contained the first real hope he'd felt in months. Now that hope was locked away in some office, probably already destroyed. The cell block erupted with whispers as Malcolm entered. Men in gray uniforms stopped their conversations and turned to stare. Some looked impressed, others looked terrified. A few looked hungry, like sharks sensing blood in the water. Malcolm's cell was on the second tier, accessible by narrow metal stairs that rang like bells under his feet. Every step announced his presence to the men below. He kept his eyes forward and his breathing steady, using techniques he'd taught young students years ago when they faced bullies in school hallways. Near the bottom of the stairs, Travis Barlow waited with 3 of his crew. Barlow had positioned himself perfectly to block Malcolm's path, without technically breaking any rules. His massive frame cast a shadow across the concrete floor. The men with him were smaller but looked eager for violence, like dogs waiting for their master's command. But Barlow didn't attack. Instead, he grabbed a skinny inmate who was carrying a metal food tray. The man looked terrified, his thin arms shaking as Barlow's thick fingers dug into his shoulder. "Go on, Anthony," Barlow said loud enough for the entire block to hear. "Show the new guy how clumsy you are." Anthony Wells looked like he might faint. He was maybe 30 years old, with pale skin and nervous eyes that darted between Barlow and Malcolm like a trapped animal looking for escape. His hands trembled as he held the tray of lukewarm soup and stale bread. "I don't want to," Anthony whispered. Barlow's grip tightened until Anthony gasped in pain. "I wasn't asking what you wanted, you worthless piece of garbage. I was telling you what's going to happen." The entire block fell silent. Men stopped playing cards, stopped reading, stopped pretending they weren't watching. This was prison theater, and everyone knew their role as audience. Barlow shoved Anthony forward so hard the smaller man stumbled. The metal tray flew from his hands, sending hot soup splashing across Malcolm's orange jumpsuit. Chunks of mystery meat and soggy vegetables dripped down his chest and legs. The crowd held its breath, waiting for Malcolm's reaction. Anthony scrambled on the floor, desperately trying to gather the scattered food with his bare hands. "I'm sorry," he said over and over. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." Malcolm looked down at the mess covering his uniform, then at Anthony's shaking form on the concrete. Slowly, deliberately, Malcolm knelt down beside the terrified man. "It's okay," Malcolm said quietly. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Accidents happen." He helped Anthony to his feet, steadying him when the smaller man wobbled. Anthony stared at Malcolm with wide, confused eyes, clearly expecting punishment instead of kindness. "Next time someone tries to push you," Malcolm said in a voice only Anthony could hear, "keep your feet wider apart, like this." He demonstrated the stance subtly, his feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent. It's harder to knock down a man who has good balance. The lesson lasted only seconds, but Luis Ortega caught every detail from across the block. The young inmate had been watching Malcolm carefully since the yard incident, trying to understand what made this man different from every other prisoner who claimed to be tough. What Luis saw wasn't tough at all. It was something else entirely. That afternoon, during laundry duty, the humid air in the basement work area made everyone's clothes stick to their skin. Industrial washing machines churned and rumbled like mechanical beasts, filling the space with constant noise and the smell of harsh detergent. Malcolm worked at one of the folding stations, methodically sorting clean prison uniforms by size. His movements were precise and efficient like everything else he did. Other inmates gave him plenty of space, still uncertain how to react to the man who had dropped Travis Barlow with such casual ease. Anthony Wells worked at the station next to Malcolm's. His hands still shook as he folded towels, jumping at every unexpected sound. When a washing machine finished its cycle with a loud buzz, Anthony dropped an entire stack of linens. Malcolm glanced around to make sure no guards were watching closely, then moved closer to Anthony's station. "Your breathing is too fast," he said quietly, while pretending to help gather the dropped towels. Anthony looked confused. "What? When you're scared, you breathe from up here." Malcolm touched his own chest lightly. "But if you breathe from down here," he moved his hand lower, "you stay calmer. Try it." Anthony followed Malcolm's quiet instructions, taking slower breaths that seemed to come from deeper in his body. Almost immediately, his hands stopped shaking so badly. "Now your feet," Malcolm continued, still speaking in a whisper. "Stand like I showed you upstairs. Feet apart, knees soft. Feel how much more solid you are?" Anthony shifted his stance. A small smile crossed his face as he realized Malcolm was right. He did feel more stable, less likely to fall if someone bumped into him. The lesson was tiny, almost invisible. To any guard watching, it looked like two inmates folding laundry and making small talk. But Malcolm was teaching survival skills disguised as conversation, showing Anthony how to carry himself with just a little more confidence. From the upper walkway that overlooked the laundry area, Travis Barlow watched through the metal grating. His eyes burned with rage as he saw Anthony standing straighter, moving with less fear. Barlow turned to the two men beside him. "You see that?" he growled. "That fat man thinks he's building himself an army. He's teaching that little weasel how to stand up." One of Barlow's crew, a tattooed man named Rico, squinted down at the laundry stations. "Looks like they're just folding clothes, boss." "You're an idiot," Barlow snapped. "He's making Wells think he doesn't have to be afraid anymore. And if Wells stops being afraid, other men might get the same stupid idea." Barlow's power in Halden Ridge depended on a simple equation. Weak men stayed weak, and strong men stayed loyal to whoever protected them from the weak men's fate. Malcolm was threatening that balance by showing Anthony that weakness wasn't permanent. "What do we do about it?" Rico asked. "Oh," Barlow's smile was cold and calculating. He'd learned patience during his years inside. Sometimes the best way to destroy an enemy was to let him think he was winning first. "We let him play teacher for now," Barlow said. "Let him gather up all the scared little rabbits and make them feel brave. Then we crush them all at once, in front of the whole prison. Show everyone what happens when you forget your place." The shower room at Halden Ridge was a place where violence lived in the steam and shadows. Gray tile covered every surface, cracked and stained from decades of neglect. 20 shower heads lined the walls, most of them dripping rusty water that pooled on the concrete floor. The air hung thick and humid, smelling of industrial soap and something else: fear. Luis Ortega stood under one of the working shower heads, trying to wash off the day's sweat and grime. He kept his eyes down, focusing on the bar of harsh prison soap in his hands. The younger inmate had survived 2 years at Halden Ridge by staying invisible, never drawing attention to himself or the dangerous men who ruled the yard. Tonight, that strategy failed him. "Well, well, look what we got here." Rico's voice echoed off the wet tiles as he and 3 other members of Barlow's crew entered the shower area. Their footsteps splashed through the shallow puddles, each sound deliberate and threatening. Luis froze, soap still in his hands. He glanced toward the entrance, but the guards had already moved to their posts outside. They never came into the shower room during evening wash time. Too much steam, too many blind spots, too easy to claim they hadn't seen whatever happened inside. "Turn around, little man," Rico commanded. His voice carried the casual cruelty that came from years of hurting weaker people. "Boss wants to have a conversation with you." Luis slowly turned, water still running down his back from the shower head above. 4 men surrounded him now, blocking every possible escape route. Rico stood directly in front of him, while the others formed a loose circle. "See? We got a problem," Rico continued, stepping closer until Luis could smell the tobacco on his breath. "That fat karate man has been filling your head with stupid ideas, teaching you to stand up straight, breathe different, act like you matter." "I don't know what you're talking about," Luis whispered, but his voice cracked with fear. Rico's laugh was harsh and ugly. Sure you don't. That's why Anthony Wells ain't jumping at shadows anymore. That's why you've been watching Malcolm like he's your new daddy. One of the other crew members, a pale man with gang tattoos covering his neck, moved closer from Luis's left side. Barlow wants to know everything the old man says, everything he teaches, every time he breathes funny. You're gonna be our eyes and ears, Rico said, grabbing Luis by the shoulders and slamming him back against the tile wall. The impact sent a shock of pain through the young man's body. You're gonna tell us when he plans his next little lesson. You're gonna report every word he says to those scared rabbits he's trying to turn into lions. Luis gasped as his back hit the cold, hard surface. I can't do that. He hasn't done anything wrong. Wrong? Rico's grip tightened, his fingers digging into Luis's skin. Boy, you don't get to decide what's wrong in here. Barlow decides. The guards decide. You just do what you're told, or you learn real fast why everyone else does. The man with the neck tattoos pulled something from his waistband, a sharpened piece of metal that had once been part of a bed frame. Prison justice was swift and permanent, and everyone in the shower room knew it. Maybe we need to give you something to remember this conversation by, Rico said, his smile turning cold and predatory. Something that'll hurt every time you think about keeping secrets from us. That's when Malcolm Rains entered the shower room. He moved through the steam like a man who belonged there, barefoot on the wet concrete, completely unafraid. His orange intake jumpsuit was tied around his waist, leaving his torso bare and revealing the solid muscle hidden beneath his heavier frame. Water droplets from the humid air beaded on his dark skin. Malcolm took in the scene with a single glance. 4 men surrounding one, the improvised weapon in neck tattoo's hand. Luis pressed against the wall with terror in his eyes, the calculating cruelty on Rico's face. Step away from him, Malcolm said quietly. His voice cut through the sound of running water and echoed off the tile walls. There was no anger in his tone, just absolute certainty. Rico turned to face him, still keeping one hand on Luis's shoulder. This ain't your business, old man. Walk away, and maybe we forget you were here. Malcolm didn't move. He stood perfectly balanced on the wet floor, his feet positioned exactly where they needed to be, his hands relaxed at his sides. I said, step away. The 4 men spread out around him now, forming a wider circle. They moved with the confidence of predators who had done this many times before. Rico released Luis and joined the formation, while Neck Tattoo kept the sharpened metal ready. You made a big mistake coming in here, Rico said, his voice echoing off the walls. Barlow was going to let you live a little longer, but now... Malcolm raised one hand, palm forward. The gesture was small, almost gentle. Last warning. The medical unit smelled like disinfectant and old bandages. Harsh, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a cold, clinical glow. Malcolm sat on the examination table, his orange jumpsuit pulled down to his waist, revealing the purple bruises spreading across his left shoulder and down his ribs. Nurse Denise Carter moved around him with practiced efficiency, her gentle hands checking for deeper injuries. She was a woman in her mid-40s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and tired eyes that had seen too much violence get explained away as accidents. This is going to hurt, she warned quietly, pressing along his shoulder blade to check for fractures. Malcolm barely flinched. The pain from the shower room fight was nothing compared to the years of carrying the weight of a false conviction. 4 men had tried to break him with fists and feet, and that sharpened piece of metal. They had learned the same lesson Travis Barlow had discovered in the yard. Underestimating Malcolm Rains was a dangerous mistake. Captain Pike is waiting outside, Denise said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He wants to file his report about what happened. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Through the thin curtain that separated them from the hallway, he could see Pike's shadow pacing back and forth. The captain had arrived at the medical unit with his clipboard already filled out, his story already written. Another violent incident caused by the new inmate who refused to follow prison rules. Denise leaned closer, pretending to examine the cut above Malcolm's left eye. The report says you started the fight, she whispered, Says you attacked 4 men in the shower room because you thought they were disrespecting you. That's not what happened, Malcolm said quietly. I know. Her voice was so soft he almost missed it. I've been working here for 8 years. I've seen Pike's reports before. They always blame the victim when it serves the system. She moved to the supply cabinet and pulled out antibiotic ointment and gauze. Her hands shook slightly as she prepared the bandages. Malcolm watched her careful movements and recognized something in her eyes, the look of someone who had stayed silent too long and was tired of watching good people get destroyed. There's something else you need to know, she continued, still speaking in whispers. An inmate named Jerome Booker has been asking about you, asking the other nurses, the orderlies, even the chaplain. He wants to talk to you, but he's scared. Malcolm had heard the name before, whispered in the yard among the men who kept their heads down and avoided trouble. Jerome was thin, nervous, and spent most of his time in the library. He never looked anyone directly in the eye. Jerome worked for a private security company before he got locked up, Denise said, applying ointment to the cut with steady fingers. Some outfit called Meridian Protection Services. He did background checks, surveillance work, witness interviews for lawyers and insurance companies. The name hit Malcolm like a physical blow. Meridian Protection Services. The same company that had provided the witnesses who testified against him 5 years ago. The same company whose employees had sworn they saw him assault a man he had actually been trying to protect. Denise saw his reaction and nodded grimly. He has documents hidden in the prison library, payment records, fake witness statements, names of people who were paid to lie in court. He's been carrying this guilt for years, and seeing you here has torn him apart. Malcolm's mind raced. All this time he had thought his conviction was just bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong witnesses. But if Jerome had proof that Meridian Protection Services had deliberately framed him, then everything was connected. The corrupt system that had destroyed his life outside was the same system protecting Travis Barlow inside. Barlow's crew is hunting Jerome, Denise continued. They know he's been asking questions. Captain Pike has already signed the transfer papers to move Jerome to another facility in 48 hours. Once he's gone, that evidence disappears forever. She stepped back and began cleaning her hands at the small sink. I can't do this alone, Malcolm. I'm just a nurse. They'll fire me or worse if they think I'm causing trouble. But I know people who might listen, good people who still believe in justice. Malcolm looked at her tired face and saw the same quiet courage he had been teaching Luis and Anthony Wells, the willingness to stand up even when you were scared. Can you get word to Reverend Gray? He asked. And to Luis Ortega on C Block? I can try. The curtain rustled as Pike's impatience grew louder outside. His boots clicked against the floor as he paced, waiting to deliver his lies to whoever would write them down as official truth. Malcolm pulled his jumpsuit back up over his shoulders, wincing as the fabric touched his bruised ribs. Tell them Jerome needs protection, and tell them the fight isn't just about the yard anymore. Denise nodded and gathered her supplies. She had done what she could. The rest was up to men who had already proven they wouldn't back down from bullies, even when the bullies wore badges and carried keys. 20 minutes later, Malcolm was being wheeled back to C Block on a transport gurney, his shoulder wrapped in white bandages and his mind focused on the 48 hours he had to save Jerome Booker's evidence. The hallway was dimmer now, lit only by the emergency lighting that stayed on through the night shift. Most inmates were locked down, but a few orderlies moved quietly through the corridors, finishing their evening duties. As Malcolm's gurney passed the library entrance, another inmate emerged from the shadows. Jerome Booker was exactly as Malcolm had imagined, thin, nervous, with eyes that darted constantly toward the guard stations. He looked like a man who had been carrying a terrible secret for too long. Jerome walked alongside the gurney for just a few steps, pretending to be heading toward the chapel. As they passed under a burned-out light fixture, he leaned down close to Malcolm's ear. "They paid me to lie about you," Jerome whispered, his voice cracking with years of suppressed guilt. Then he was gone, disappearing back into the shadows before the transport guard noticed anything unusual. The morning count echoed through C Block like thunder, guards shouting numbers while inmates stood at attention beside their bunks. Malcolm pressed his back against the cold concrete wall, feeling the fresh bandages pull tight across his shoulder. The pain reminded him of last night's whispered confession and the 48 hours that were already slipping away. Rains, work rotation. The guard's voice cut through the metallic clang of cell doors sliding open. Malcolm stepped into the hallway where Luis waited, his young face tense with the kind of worry that came from knowing too much. Reverend Gray emerged from his cell 3 doors down, moving with the careful dignity of a man who had learned to carry hope through the darkest places. They walked together through the main corridor, their footsteps joining the steady rhythm of inmates heading to their assigned jobs. Malcolm kept his voice low as they passed the guard stations. "Jerome has what we need," he told them, "but Barlow's people know he's been asking questions." Luis nodded, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I saw 2 of them watching the library entrance yesterday, acting like they were cleaning, but their eyes never left the door." Reverend Gray's weathered face remained calm, but Malcolm caught the flash of steel in his eyes. The boy's been carrying this burden too long. Time to set it down before it kills him. The library sat at the end of a long hallway, its heavy wooden door marked with faded signs about quiet hours and book return policies. The room beyond was cramped and poorly lit, with metal shelves packed tight together and fluorescent bulbs that flickered constantly. Most inmates avoided the place, preferring the yard or the television room to the musty silence between the stacks. Malcolm pushed through the entrance first, scanning the narrow aisles between towering shelves. The law section occupied the back corner, hidden behind thick volumes of case studies and legal precedents that most inmates couldn't understand and wouldn't read. Jerome crouched there like a frightened animal, his thin frame pressed against the dusty spines of constitutional law text. His eyes darted toward every sound, every shadow, every footstep in the hallway beyond. When he saw Malcolm approaching, relief flooded his face. "I kept copies," Jerome whispered, pulling a folded packet from between 2 thick volumes on civil procedure. "Payment records, witness statements, everything they made me forge. Your dojo was sitting on prime real estate, and they needed you gone." Malcolm's jaw tightened as Jerome's words confirmed what Denise had suggested. His community karate school hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It had been deliberately targeted by men who saw profit in empty lots and broken dreams. Jerome's hands shook as he held out the packet. "I was supposed to interview witnesses, make sure their stories matched. But the stories weren't real. They paid people to say they saw things that never happened." Before Malcolm could take the evidence, heavy footsteps thundered through the library entrance. Travis Barlow's voice boomed through the stacks like a war cry. "Time for some education, old man." 3 of Barlow's crew spread out through the aisles, moving with the practiced coordination of men who had done this before. They flipped reading tables onto their sides with crashes that echoed off the concrete walls. One grabbed a heavy metal bookend, swinging it like a club as he advanced toward the law section. Malcolm heard the sharp click of the library door locking from outside. Captain Pike's voice carried through the thick wood, addressing someone in the hallway. "Give them 10 minutes, Pike said clearly. "Then we'll respond to the disturbance." Malcolm stepped between Jerome and the advancing attackers, his movements careful and controlled despite the fury building in his chest. "Luis, take the packet. Don't fight. Just protect what matters." Luis grabbed the evidence from Jerome's trembling hands, stuffing it deep into his waistband as metal crashed against concrete around them. The aisles were narrow, forcing Barlow's men to come at them one at a time between the towering shelves. The first attacker swung his makeshift weapon in a wild arc, trying to crush Malcolm's skull. Malcolm shifted his weight, letting the bookend whistle past his ear and crash into the shelf behind him. Law books tumbled to the floor as Malcolm grabbed the man's wrist, using his momentum to drive him face first into the metal frame. Another man tried to circle around through the adjacent aisle, but Malcolm was already moving, using the narrow space like a maze. He caught the attacker's ankle as the man climbed over a fallen table, sending him crashing into a stack of reference books. Jerome pressed himself deeper into the corner as chaos erupted around him. Shelves groaned under the weight of struggling bodies. Books scattered across the floor like wounded birds. The third attacker pulled out a sharpened piece of metal, crude but deadly in the dim light. He lunged toward Jerome, knowing that eliminating the witness was more important than fighting Malcolm. Malcolm spun between the shelves, but the angle was wrong, the space too narrow. The weapon caught Jerome in the side, tearing through his thin prison jumpsuit and drawing a line of bright blood across his ribs. Jerome gasped, but stayed conscious, his eyes finding Luis across the wreckage. With his last burst of strength, he pushed forward, making sure the evidence was secure. The lock clicked open exactly 10 minutes later. Captain Pike stepped through the doorway, surveying the destruction with practiced theatrical shock. "Jesus Christ!" Pike announced loudly for the guards gathering behind him. "Rains, what have you done now?" The medical unit smelled like disinfectant and fear. Jerome lay on the narrow examination table, his thin chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. The wound along his ribs wasn't deep enough to kill, but it bled steadily through the gauze Denise pressed against it. "Hold still," Denise murmured, her voice gentle but urgent. She worked quickly, cleaning the cut, while her eyes darted toward the door. The guards had brought Jerome here after Pike's dramatic discovery in the library, but they hadn't stayed to watch her work. That was their first mistake. Malcolm sat on a plastic chair nearby, his hands resting calmly on his knees. His knuckles showed no cuts, no swelling, no signs of the violence Pike claimed he had started. Denise pulled out her phone, the small camera making almost no sound as she captured image after image. Jerome's clean wound, Malcolm's unmarked hands, the defensive injuries on Jerome's palms, where he had tried to protect himself from a blade. "This wasn't a fight," Denise whispered as she worked. "Someone tried to kill you, Jerome, and Malcolm protected you." Jerome nodded weakly, his eyes finding Malcolm's face. "The papers," he gasped. "Did Luis?" "Safe," Malcolm said quietly. "Focus on healing." After bandaging Jerome's ribs, Denise sent both men back to their cells with different guards. She waited 20 minutes, then locked herself in the staff break room and pulled out the restricted phone mounted on the wall. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number she had memorized from Malcolm's legal papers. The phone rang twice before a sharp voice answered. "Bell and Associates, this is Anita." "Ms. Bell, this is Nurse Carter at Halden Ridge State Prison. You represent Malcolm Raines." "I do. What's happened?" Denise took a deep breath. "Your client was attacked today. They're claiming he started a fight, but I have evidence proving otherwise. And there's more. Another inmate has documentation that could clear Malcolm's name entirely." The silence on the other end stretched for several heartbeats. Then Anita's voice turned cold and focused. "What kind of documentation?" "Payment records, false witness statements, names connecting Malcolm's original case to current prison contracts. Everything. I'm coming tomorrow morning. First visiting period. Have Malcolm ready." The line went dead. Denise stared at the phone, hope and terror warring in her chest. She had just crossed a line she could never step back over. 3 floors above, Luis moved through the evening meal line like a ghost. The packet Jerome had given him felt like fire against his skin, hidden beneath layers of clothing where the guards couldn't find it during casual searches. He found Reverend Gray sitting alone at a corner table, reading from a worn Bible while inmates avoided his quiet presence. "Reverend," Luis said, sliding onto the bench beside him, "I need your help." Gray's weathered eyes studied the young man's face. "What kind of help, son?" Luis glanced around the dining hall, then leaned closer. Under the table, his hands moved quickly, transferring the folded packet to Gray's waiting fingers. The old preacher palmed the papers without looking down, his expression never changing. "Evidence," Luis whispered, "for Malcolm. Jerome almost died protecting it." Gray nodded slowly, sliding the Bible closed around the packet. "Some truths are worth dying for. This stays between us." That evening, Gray sat alone in his cell, carefully opening the binding of his old Bible with a blade fashioned from a toothbrush handle. The pages parted like wings, creating a hollow space where the evidence could rest safely between verses about justice and redemption. Malcolm lay on his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and thinking about tomorrow's visit. For the first time since arriving at Halden Ridge, real hope stirred in his chest. Anita Bell would come. She would see Jerome's wounds, review the evidence, and carry the truth beyond these walls where corrupt guards couldn't bury it. 3 cells down, Travis Barlow paced like a caged animal. The library attack had failed. Jerome was alive, and worse, the papers had disappeared during the chaos. Barlow's outside connections wouldn't tolerate loose ends that threatened their profitable arrangements. Fear made his hands shake as he realized his protection depended on Malcolm Raines never seeing another sunrise. At midnight, Captain Pike led a team of guards through the cell blocks, conducting what he called a random security sweep. They tore through Malcolm's belongings first, shredding his letters, dumping his few books, searching every corner for the evidence they knew existed somewhere. They found nothing. Pike's face grew darker with each empty cell, each failed search. His men ransacked Jerome's space, then Luis's, then moved systematically through anyone who had spoken to Malcolm in recent days. The evidence had vanished like smoke. "Lockdown?" Pike snarled into his radio. "Effective immediately. No movement, no visits, no exceptions." At dawn, Malcolm woke to the sound of boots marching down the corridor. 6 guards stopped outside his cell, their faces hidden behind riot helmets. Pike stood behind them, his smile cold as winter steel. "Rise and shine, Raines. You're being transferred to a more secure location." Malcolm sat up slowly, meeting Pike's eyes through the bars. "Anita Bell has a scheduled visit this morning." "Anita Bell," Pike said, savoring each word as the guards unlocked Malcolm's door, "will never get through the gate." Heavy hands grabbed Malcolm's arms, dragging him from his cell toward the stairwell that led down into the basement levels where the old punishment block waited in darkness. The old punishment block smelled like decades of despair soaked into concrete walls. Malcolm sat on the bare metal frame where a mattress should have been, his back straight despite the damp cold seeping through his jumpsuit. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness beyond his cell, marking time with steady precision. Above him, the laundry machines rumbled and groaned through their cycles, the sound filtering down through thick floors like distant thunder. Captain Pike stood outside the bars, his flashlight beam cutting harsh shadows across Malcolm's face. The corridor stretched behind him into complete blackness, broken only by the pale glow of emergency lighting that barely reached the cells. "No mattress tonight, Raines," Pike said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Budget cuts, you understand? Have to make do with what we got down here." Malcolm met his stare without flinching. "When does my attorney visit get rescheduled?" Pike's laugh was sharp and cruel. "That's the beautiful thing about protective custody. No outside contact until we determine you're no longer a threat to prison security." He stepped closer to the bars, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Could take weeks, months even." The captain turned to leave, then paused as if remembering something important. "Oh, and Barlow's getting transferred down here before morning. Protective separation, of course. Can't have you two in the same block after that nasty fight." His smile was all teeth and malice. "Don't worry, though. These old cells weren't built with cameras. What happens down here stays down here." Pike's footsteps echoed up the stairwell until only silence remained. Malcolm understood the message perfectly. They had isolated him in a forgotten corner of the prison where witnesses couldn't reach him and evidence couldn't survive. The damp walls would muffle screams, and the missing cameras would ensure no proof of what happened next. 5 floors above in the main cell block, Luis pressed his face against the narrow window of his door, trying to see down the corridor. Evening count had finished 30 minutes ago, but Malcolm's cell remained dark and empty. "Where is he?" Luis whispered to Anthony, who occupied the cell next door. Anthony's voice trembled through the ventilation gap between their walls. Guards came for him right after dawn, 6 of them with riot gear. Said it was a transfer. Transfer where? Nobody knows. Pike won't say nothing. Luis felt ice forming in his stomach. Malcolm had vanished just hours before his attorney was supposed to arrive. The timing couldn't be coincidence. In the chapel wing, Reverend Gray knelt beside his narrow bunk, carefully extracting the hidden Bible from beneath loose floorboards. His weathered fingers traced the binding, where Jerome's evidence rested safely between pages of Scripture. The old preacher had survived 40 years in the system by understanding when silence meant survival and when silence meant death. Tonight, silence would kill the only good man left in Halden Ridge. Gray made his way through the darkened corridor, moving with the practiced stealth of someone who had learned to walk unseen. He found Nurse Carter finishing her rounds in the medical wing, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "They turned away his lawyer," Denise said without preamble, keeping her voice low. "Fake security order. Pike told the gate guards that all legal visits were suspended pending investigation." Investigation of what? Malcolm's alleged gang connections. Complete fabrication, but the paperwork looked official. Her hand shook as she organized medication bottles on her cart. "I tried to call Bell directly, but they've blocked outside phone access from the medical ward." Gray nodded slowly, understanding the scope of the trap closing around Malcolm. Pike had systematically eliminated every legitimate channel that might expose the truth, but corruption always left gaps for those desperate enough to find them. "I need Anthony Wells," Gray said quietly. "Can you get him assigned to chapel detail tomorrow morning?" Denise studied his face, recognizing the resolve in his eyes. "That boy's scared of his own shadow. What makes you think he'll help?" "Because Malcolm stood up for him when nobody else would. Sometimes that's enough to make a coward brave." 20 minutes later, Gray stood outside Anthony's cell, his voice barely above a whisper as he explained what needed to happen. Anthony's face went pale in the dim corridor lighting. "You want me to carry what?" Anthony's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Evidence that could save Malcolm's life, and maybe yours too, if Barlow decides you know too much." Anthony's hands trembled against the cell bars. "But if they catch me? If they catch Malcolm alone down there, he's dead by morning, and once he's gone, they'll come for anyone who helped him. That includes you, son." The truth of those words settled over Anthony like a heavy blanket. He had spent years surviving by staying invisible, avoiding conflict, letting stronger men decide his fate. But Malcolm had treated him with dignity when everyone else saw only weakness. For the first time in his adult life, someone had protected him without asking for anything in return. "What do I have to do?" Anthony whispered. Gray explained the plan quickly. During dawn chapel service, Anthony would carry the Bible to the volunteer work crew that cleaned the visiting area. One of those volunteers had outside connections through the chaplain's office. The evidence would reach legitimate investigators before Pike could bury it deeper. "Stay calm," Gray warned. "Act normal. If anyone asks, you're just helping with Sunday preparations." Anthony nodded, terror and determination warring in his chest. He thought about Malcolm's steady voice, the way the older man had stepped between him and Barlow's crew without hesitation. Maybe it was time to return that courage, even if his knees shook with every step. Deep beneath the laundry wing, Malcolm heard footsteps echoing down the stairwell. Heavy boots, multiple sets, moving with purpose through the darkness. He closed his eyes and began the breathing exercises his sensei had taught him decades ago. Slow inhalation, controlled release, centering his mind while his body prepared for whatever violence was coming. The footsteps grew louder, closer, accompanied by the rattle of keys and the low murmur of voices discussing plans that would never reach official reports. Malcolm breathed deeper, finding calm in the approaching storm. The heavy metal door creaked open in the punishment block's basement corridor. Captain Pike stepped through first, his polished boots echoing against concrete, as he surveyed the narrow hallway lined with isolation cells. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes held the cold satisfaction of a man watching pieces fall into place. "Cell 3, Pike said quietly, stepping aside. Travis Barlow entered behind him, flanked by 5 inmates who moved like predators scenting wounded prey. The joking, loud-mouthed bully from the yard was gone. This version of Barlow carried himself with deadly focus, his scarred knuckles already wrapped in leather strips. The men behind him clutched makeshift weapons, sharpened metal, wrapped chains, tools that would leave no fingerprints on official reports. "Open it," Barlow ordered. Pike's keys jangled as he unlocked Malcolm's cell door. The metal scraped against stone, a sound that echoed through the empty corridor like a death knell. Malcolm emerged slowly, his movements controlled despite the stiffness from hours on the concrete floor. "Should have stayed down in the yard," Barlow said, his voice stripped of all pretense. "Should have let them boys keep you afraid like they was supposed to, but you had to show off, had to make me look weak." Malcolm said nothing, his eyes tracking each man's position, while his feet found proper stance on the uneven floor. The cell doorway created a bottleneck, but the corridor offered more room to move. He stepped backward, drawing them into open space. "See, the thing is," Barlow continued, advancing with his crew, "when you embarrass me, you embarrass people who pay good money to keep this place running smooth. People don't like losing their investments." The first attack came without warning. A lean inmate with prison tattoos covering his neck lunged forward, swinging a chain-wrapped fist toward Malcolm's temple. Malcolm shifted his weight onto his back foot, raising his forearm to intercept the blow. The chain bit into his skin, but the strike's power dissipated against solid bone and muscle. Malcolm grabbed the man's extended wrist, used his momentum to pivot, and drove him face first into the concrete wall. Blood splattered across gray stone. The second attacker rushed while Malcolm was engaged, but decades of training had taught him to fight multiple opponents. Malcolm dropped low, sweeping the man's legs while rising to catch him with an elbow strike to the ribs. The sound of breaking bone echoed through the corridor, but Malcolm was 50 years old and carrying extra weight. Each movement cost energy he couldn't afford to waste. His breathing grew heavier as the remaining 4 men circled him like wolves, forcing him to constantly turn and adjust his position. "Look at that," Barlow taunted. "The karate master's getting tired. All that fancy footwork don't mean much when you're outnumbered." A muscular inmate with crude gang tattoos feinted left, then came in low with a sharpened piece of rebar. Malcolm caught the weapon hand at the wrist, but couldn't prevent the man's shoulder from driving into his midsection. They crashed against the wall together, concrete scraping Malcolm's back through his thin shirt. Malcolm broke the grapple with a precise knee strike, but Barlow was already moving. The yard boss's fist connected solidly with Malcolm's ribs, driving air from his lungs with brutal efficiency. Pain flared across his side as damaged cartilage protested the impact. Another attacker slashed with a piece of broken glass, opening a gash across Malcolm's left shoulder. Blood soaked through orange fabric as Malcolm stumbled backward, his defensive spacing compromised by the narrow corridor walls. 3 floors above in the chapel wing, Anthony Wells clutched Reverend Gray's Bible against his chest, his hands shaking as he approached the morning service area. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air, and his footsteps echoed too loudly in the empty hallway. "Just act normal," he whispered to himself. "Just walk normal." The chapel guard, a thick-set man named Morrison, looked up from his clipboard as Anthony entered, his eyes immediately focused on the trembling inmate and the worn Bible in his hands. "What you got there, Wells?" Morrison's voice cut through the morning quiet. Anthony's mouth went dry. Just helping Reverend Gray with Sunday preparations, sir. He asked me to—" Morrison stepped forward, his hand extending toward the Bible, his fingers wrapped around the worn leather binding, tugging it from Anthony's desperate grip. "Let me see that." Malcolm rolled sideways just as the metal pipe crashed into concrete where his head had been, sparks flying from the impact. The sound rang through the narrow corridor like a gunshot. He came up on one knee, his ribs screaming protest, and drove his fist into the pipe wielder's solar plexus. The man doubled over, gasping, but there was no time to recover. Barlow's remaining crew pressed their advantage, forcing Malcolm backward toward the corridor's end. His shoulders hit the heavy metal door that led to the old laundry room. Behind him, rusted hinges groaned as the door gave way under his weight. Malcolm stumbled through the opening into a space that hadn't been used for regular prison operations in years. Ancient washing machines lined the walls like metal tombstones, their surfaces thick with dust and rust. Overhead pipes leaked steam in steady hisses, creating a hazy fog that turned the air thick and humid. The concrete floor was slick with condensation and decades of accumulated grime. "Now you got nowhere to run, old man," Barlow snarled, following him into the room with his 3 remaining attackers. The space was larger than the corridor, but filled with obstacles. Industrial laundry carts on wheels, hanging chains from old pulley systems, and sheets draped over drying lines that created a maze of fabric barriers. Steam burst from a broken pipe near the ceiling as Barlow's first man charged forward. The scalding mist obscured his vision for a crucial second. Malcolm grabbed the handle of a metal laundry cart and shoved it hard into the attacker's path. The cart's wheels shrieked against concrete as it crashed into the man's shins, sending him tumbling over the metal frame. Malcolm pivoted, using the cart as a barrier, and caught the man's extended arm as he tried to climb over. With precise leverage, he twisted the limb and slammed it down against the cart's metal edge. Bone snapped. The man's scream echoed off the tile walls as his arm bent at an impossible angle, trapped between the cart's frame and his own body weight. A second attacker came from Malcolm's blind side, slipping on the wet floor as he tried to change direction. Malcolm swept his feet just as the man lost balance, sending him crashing into a row of old pipes. Water sprayed everywhere, adding to the chaos of steam and mist that filled the room. The third man grabbed a hanging sheet and tried to use it as a net, swinging it toward Malcolm's head to blind him. Malcolm caught the fabric with both hands, yanked hard, and pulled the attacker forward into a perfectly timed knee strike. But instead of releasing the sheet, Malcolm twisted it around the man's wrists and used his momentum to spin him into a support beam. The impact left him dazed and tangled in wet fabric. Steam hissed louder now, making the air almost impossible to breathe. Sweat poured down Malcolm's face, mixing with blood from his shoulder wound. His chest rose and fell heavily as he backed toward the center of the room, putting distance between himself and the scattered attackers. "You think you're clever?" Barlow's voice cut through the fog. He moved slowly now, deliberately, a sharpened piece of rebar in his right hand. "All this dancing around ain't gonna save you. I got all day." Through the doorway, Captain Pike watched with barely contained fury. His jaw worked silently as he took in the scene. 3 of his hand-picked inmates down, Malcolm still standing, and his carefully planned execution falling apart in a cloud of steam and chaos. Pike's radio crackled to life. Even through the static, the voice was urgent and clear. "Captain Pike to the chapel immediately. Security breach. Inmate disturbance. All units respond." 4 floors above, Anthony Wells broke free from Guard Morrison's grip and ran into the main chapel area, his voice cracking as he shouted, "Nurse Carter! Nurse Carter!" The stolen Bible fell from his hands, its pages scattering across the floor as other inmates and staff turned to stare. Denise rushed forward from the medical station, her eyes immediately focusing on the scattered evidence at Anthony's feet. She dropped to her knees and began gathering the pages, her face pale with recognition of what they contained. Pike's voice turned deadly cold as he spoke into his radio. "Copy that." He looked at Barlow through the steam. "End this. Now." Malcolm backed against a wall of rusted pipes, his chest heaving as blood seeped through his torn shirt. The steam made everything look like a nightmare. Barlow circled him slowly, the sharpened rebar gleaming in his hand. 2 men flanked the bully, the one still able to stand after the chaos. "Tired yet, old man?" Barlow sneered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You've been dancing around this room like some kind of circus act, but the show's over." Malcolm's shoulder throbbed where the earlier cut had reopened. His legs felt heavy. His breathing came in short bursts. Every instinct told him to keep moving, keep dodging, keep looking for an escape that didn't exist. Then something shifted inside him. The room went quiet around Malcolm, even with the hiss of steam and drip of water. His heartbeat slowed. His breathing deepened. Years of training took over. Not the frantic survival he'd been using, but the centered discipline he'd spent decades perfecting. Malcolm planted his feet shoulder-width apart, his hands lowered to his sides, his back straightened against the wall behind him. "What's wrong with you?" Barlow demanded, confused by the sudden change. "You giving up?" Malcolm said nothing, his eyes fixed on Barlow's center, watching the way the man held the weapon, the tension in his shoulders, the slight favor of his left leg. Barlow's face twisted with rage at being ignored. "I asked you a question." He charged forward with the rebar raised high, putting all his weight behind a downward strike meant to crack Malcolm's skull. The weapon whistled through the humid air. Malcolm stepped inside the swing instead of away from it. His left hand shot up to catch Barlow's wrist just as the weapon began its descent. His right hand drove up into Barlow's elbow, hyperextending the joint with a wet pop. Barlow screamed as his grip loosened. Malcolm twisted the wrist sharply, and the rebar clattered across the wet concrete floor. The first attacker rushed from behind, thinking Malcolm was distracted. Malcolm heard the footsteps splashing through puddles. He dropped into a low crouch, spun, and drove his shoulder into the man's midsection. The impact lifted the attacker off his feet and sent him crashing into a wheeled laundry cart. Metal screamed against concrete as both man and cart slammed into the wall. The final man looked at his two fallen companions, then at Malcolm rising from his crouch with blood on his shirt and murder in his eyes. The man's nerve broke completely. He backed toward the doorway, hands raised. "I ain't part of this," he stammered. "This was Barlow's idea. I'm done." Barlow cradled his injured arm against his chest, his face pale with shock and pain, but his eyes still burned with hate. "You think this is over? You think you won something?" He lunged again with his good arm, trying to tackle Malcolm around the waist. It was desperation now, not strategy. Malcolm turned his hips cleanly, letting Barlow's momentum carry him forward into empty air. As the bully stumbled past, Malcolm's right hand struck down precisely at the base of Barlow's neck, not to kill, but to drop him hard onto the wet concrete. Barlow hit the floor face first and stayed there, conscious but unable to move. His breathing was labored. His eyes stared at nothing. "You understand now?" Malcolm asked quietly, standing over him. "You never had power. You just had permission." Heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Not the familiar march of prison guards, but the sharp click of dress shoes and urgent voices. "This way," a woman's voice called. "The nurse said they'd be in the old laundry section." Captain Pike appeared in the doorway first, his face flushed with panic. "Ma'am, this area is restricted. You can't—" Anita Bell pushed past him without hesitation, followed by two men in dark suits carrying briefcases and cameras. State investigators. Their eyes took in the scene immediately. Malcolm standing bloodied but upright, Barlow motionless on the floor, the scattered weapons, the blocked exits. "What happened here, Captain?" Anita demanded, her voice cutting through the steam. Pike's mouth opened and closed like a fish. The inmate attacked. "We had to—" "With what weapon?" One investigator knelt beside the rebar, photographing it without touching. "He's dangerous. We were protecting—" "Who were you protecting from an unarmed man?" Anita stepped closer to Pike. "And why are your guards blocking the exits while inmates carry weapons?" The second investigator pulled out a small device and pointed it toward the ceiling corners. "These cameras are active," he announced. "Someone turned them back on." Pike's face went white. The afternoon sun beat down on the main yard as every inmate at Halden Ridge was ordered outside. Guards stood at attention along the fence, their faces grim and uncertain. Nobody spoke. The men just watched as black cars with government plates rolled through the prison gates, one after another. Malcolm stood near the basketball court, his shoulder wrapped in clean bandages from the medical unit. The cut had required 12 stitches, but Nurse Carter had worked carefully to minimize the scarring. Luis stayed close beside him, nervously shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Never seen this many suits in one place," Luis whispered. Anthony pressed closer to Malcolm's other side, his thin frame trembling despite the heat. "What's happening?" Before Malcolm could answer, the main building doors opened. Captain Pike emerged in handcuffs, flanked by two state investigators. His uniform shirt was wrinkled and stained with sweat. The man who had ruled Halden Ridge through fear and corruption now stumbled forward like any other criminal being led to justice. A murmur rippled through the yard. Men who had been beaten, humiliated, and terrorized by Pike's orders watched him shuffle past in chains. Some stood taller, others clenched their fists. All of them stared. "Look at that piece of garbage," someone muttered from the back of the crowd. Pike's eyes swept across the inmates, searching for something he would never find again: respect born from fear. Instead, he saw contempt, raw, undisguised hatred from men who knew exactly what kind of monster he was beneath the badge and uniform. The doors opened again. Warden Dale Mercer appeared, his expensive suit replaced with an orange jumpsuit identical to the ones worn by every man in the yard. His hands were cuffed behind his back, his face pale and drawn. Anita Bell walked beside the officers escorting him, a thick folder of documents tucked under her arm. Mercer's arrest stems from a pattern of civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and financial fraud, Anita announced to the gathered media crews now filming from outside the fence. State investigators have uncovered systematic corruption, linking the warden to blocked legal visits, falsified discipline reports, and payments from outside criminal organizations. Mercer's legs nearly gave out when he saw the cameras. The man who had hidden behind institutional power and political connections was now being displayed like any other criminal. His carefully constructed public image crumbled with each step toward the transport van. The inmates watched in stunned silence. This was the man who had decided who lived and who died inside these walls. He had protected predators, punished victims, and buried the truth whenever it threatened his profits. Now, he wore the same orange uniform as the men whose lives he had destroyed. "My God," Reverend Gray breathed from somewhere in the crowd. "Justice done come to Halden Ridge at last." The doors opened one final time. Barlow emerged on a wheeled stretcher, conscious but unable to walk. His face was bruised and swollen from the fight in the laundry room. His left arm hung in a sling, and his eyes darted frantically around the yard as he was loaded into an ambulance marked with state police logos. Without Pike's protection, without Mercer's institutional cover, Barlow was just another violent criminal heading to maximum security. The inmates who had cowered from him for years watched him being strapped down like a medical patient. Some spat on the ground. Others simply nodded with grim satisfaction. Anita approached Malcolm as the transport vehicles pulled away. Her face showed exhaustion, but also fierce triumph. Jerome's evidence has been authenticated by federal investigators. Bank records, payment schedules, witness statements, everything you need to prove the frame-up. She pulled a legal document from her briefcase. "The state court has granted an emergency hearing to review your conviction. We're looking at full exoneration, Malcolm. Complete vindication." Malcolm took the papers, but didn't smile. His eyes moved across the yard, finding Luis, Anthony, Reverend Gray standing near the chapel entrance, and Nurse Carter watching from the medical building window. These people had risked everything to help him survive. They deserved to see justice served more than he deserved freedom. "When?" Malcolm asked quietly. 2 weeks. Maybe sooner if the federal prosecutor moves fast. Malcolm nodded once. Justice delayed was still justice denied for the men who would remain in Halden Ridge long after he walked free. 3 days later, Malcolm emerged from his cell wearing standard gray instead of the orange jumpsuit that had marked him as fresh prey. The men in the yard looked up as he passed, not with the predatory interest of before, but with something approaching respect. He walked slowly toward the basketball court, where Luis was shooting alone. The young man's face brightened when he saw Malcolm approaching in gray. "Looks good on you," Luis said, passing him the ball. Malcolm caught it cleanly and took a shot from the free-throw line. The ball swished through the net without touching iron. Around the yard, men stopped their conversations to watch. Word had spread about what happened in the laundry room, about the arrests, about the investigations that were tearing apart years of corruption. Anthony jogged over from the wait area, his stride more confident than before. "Reverend Gray wants to see you in the chapel." he said. "Says he's got something to show you." Malcolm retrieved the basketball and passed it back to Luis. As he walked toward the chapel, inmates nodded in his direction. Not the fearful acknowledgement given to violent predators like Barlow, but the genuine respect earned by a man who had protected others without losing his humanity. The afternoon shadows grew longer as Malcolm crossed the yard. Above him, the watchtowers still loomed against the sky, but the men inside them were different now. State corrections officers had replaced Pike's cronies. The investigations were far from over. Malcolm paused beneath the main watchtower and looked up at the guard station. The officer inside was young, clean-shaven, and watching the yard with professional attention rather than predatory amusement. Their eyes met briefly. The guard nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement between two men doing their jobs. Standing in that spot, where he had first been marked as prey, Malcolm felt the weight of everything that had happened since his arrival. The prison that had tried to break him was finally being held accountable for its crime. The system that had buried the truth was being forced to face the light. He was still an inmate in an orange world painted gray, but he was no longer alone, no longer hunted, and no longer silent about the injustices that thrived in darkness. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.